September 1945. Tokyo is no longer a city of wood and paper. It is a sprawling, blackened graveyard of skeletal steel and gray ash. The morning air carries the scent of stale charcoal and the metallic tang of sea salt drifting from the harbor, where the massive gray hulls of the United States Navy now sit in silent, terrifying repose. In the Setagaya ward, a woman named Hannah stands amidst the rubble of what was once a neighborhood of tea-houses and sliding doors. She shifts the weight of her emaciated child against her hip, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the first dust clouds of American convoys begin to rise. The silence is absolute, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of gravel under heavy rubber tires, a sound that, for years, the Imperial government promised would mean the end of the Japanese soul. To understand this moment is to understand a nation that had been spiritually and physically hollowed out by a decade of total war. Japan had entered the conflict under the banner of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, fueled by a belief in Seishin, the invincible Japanese spirit that could supposedly overcome any material disadvantage. By late 1945, that spirit was all that remained. The cities had been systematically incinerated by B-29 firebombing raids, leaving millions homeless and living in dugout shelters. The Kaidatsu state, a condition of profound exhaustion and despair, had settled over the populace like a second skin. They were a people waiting for the Kichiku-bei, the Oni or demons of the West, to arrive and begin the final slaughter. The contrast between expectation and reality was a psychological tremor that shook the foundations of Japanese society. For years, schoolgirls had been trained to fight with sharpened bamboo spears, told that the Americans were weak, pampered cowards who would crumble before the divine winds of the kamikaze. The mothers of Tokyo expected rapacious invaders who would burn what little was left of their honor. Instead, they watched from the shadows of charred telegraph poles as massive, olive-drab Studebaker trucks rumbled through the ruins. The American soldiers did not carry torches. They carried crates. They did not shout commands of execution. They chewed gum with a casual, terrifying confidence that spoke of a world where hunger was a foreign concept. Every sensory detail of the occupation was a revelation of American industrial might. The sound of a heavy truck engine idling wasn't just noise. It was the sound of a civilization that had more fuel than it knew how to burn. Hannah watched as a group of GIs hopped down from their vehicles, their uniforms clean, their boots thick and sturdy, unlike the rotting canvas tobbies worn by the remnants of the Imperial Army. These men represented a material abundance that the Japanese had been told was a sign of moral decay. Yet, as the dust settled over the ruins of the local primary school, a different kind of payload was being prepared for delivery. The crates being pried open did not contain ammunition or bayonets. They contained the first seeds of a new world, beginning with the very objects that would eventually break the hearts of every mother in the district. The sun began to catch the glint of something metallic and polished inside those crates, a sight so alien to the scorched earth of Tokyo that it felt like a hallucination. The ideology of the Japanese Empire had been built upon a foundation of absolute sacrifice. For years, the civilian population lived under the National Mobilization Law, a decree that stripped the home front of every luxury and eventually every necessity. To the mothers of Tokyo, the war had become a slow theft of their children's future. Families had surrendered their bronze statues, their iron fences, and even their cooking pots to be melted down for the imperial war machine. This was the shadow of the divine wind, a belief that the more the people suffered, the more pure their spirit became, and the more likely a miracle would save them from the encroaching Allied forces. By the time General Douglas MacArthur's motorcade began to frequent the streets, this spiritual purity had manifested as a hollow, aching starvation. The historical reality of late 1945 was a country that had not only lost its military power but its belief in the structural sanity of the world. The Japanese people were trapped in a vacuum between the old world of Shinto state divinity and a new, terrifyingly unknown Western occupation. They expected the Americans to be mirrors of their own military, disciplined, harsh, and resource-depleted. They expected a struggle for survival against a vengeful victor. Instead, the Japanese women watched as a logistical miracle began to unfold. It was a shock to the collective psyche to realize that while Japan had been scraping the bottom of its rice bins, the American machine had been producing surplus. The kaidatsu state was not just physical hunger. It was a mental collapse caused by the realization that they had been lied to. The Americans weren't just victors, they were providers. The propaganda had insisted that the American way of life was a decadent weakness, yet that very decadence had produced a surplus of steel and wood so vast that it could be shipped across the Pacific to furnish the schools of a defeated enemy. This period marked a radical shift in how the Japanese viewed the concepts of power and authority. The emperor had asked for their lives. The Americans were asking for their children to sit in classrooms. The historical weight of this transition cannot be overstated. It was the moment the Satian spirit met the reality of American logistics. The sound of the American trucks, that low, powerful hum of a V8 engine, became the recurring heartbeat of the occupation. It was a sound that represented a terrifying abundance. To a mother like Hannah, who had spent the last year boiling grass and sawdust to fill her son's stomach, the mere sight of a crate being handled with casual indifference by a well-fed GI was a revelation of a different kind of strength. It was the strength of a system that didn't need its people to starve in order to win. As the schools were surveyed for reconstruction, the physical evidence of this ideological difference was about to arrive in the form of a shipment that would change the emotional landscape of the nation forever. To understand the tears that would later fall, one must look at the physical environment of the Japanese child in 1945. 4 years, the classroom had been a site of Spartan conditioning. As the war effort intensified, the few resources available to schools were diverted to the front. The desks that remained in the village schools were often nothing more than rough-hewn planks of scrap wood, splintered and unstable, supported by stones or salvaged ammunition boxes. In the final months of the war, even these were often broken up for firewood to keep children from freezing during the long, hungry winters. The schoolhouse was not a place of comfort, but a theater of endurance, where children sat on cold dirt floors, their fingers blue with chill, tracing kanji into the dust because paper had become a luxury of the past. This physical deprivation was a deliberate component of the wartime experience. The Ministry of Education had emphasized that material hardship was a forge for the Japanese soul. A child did not need a sturdy chair or a smooth writing surface if they possessed the Yamato Damashii, the indomitable Japanese spirit. However, as the hunger deepened, this rhetoric began to fray. The daily caloric intake for a Japanese civilian had plummeted to dangerous levels, and the sight of their children growing thin and listless in darkened, freezing classrooms was a silent agony for the mothers. They were living in a world of scarcity so absolute that the concept of newness had entirely vanished. Everything was mended, everything was recycled, and everything was failing. Then came the American school desk. It arrived as a ghost from a world that should not exist according to the laws of wartime Japan. In the shipping manifests of the Civil Information and Education section, these items were listed as mere furniture, but to the Japanese eye, they were artifacts of a different dimension. The recurring sound of the American trucks, that heavy mechanical growl, heralded their arrival at the school gates. When the back of the first truck was lowered, the mothers gathered at a distance, their faces masked with the practiced stoicism of the defeated. They expected to see more machinery of war, perhaps more supplies for the GIs, but instead they saw rows of uniform, gleaming objects. The steel of these desks was not the brittle, recycled pig iron of the Japanese home front. It was high-grade, smooth, and painted in a calm industrial green. The wood was not scrap, but kiln-dried maple, sanded to a finish so fine it felt like silk under the touch. To a woman who had spent years searching for a single straight nail or a scrap of unburnt lumber, the sheer quality of these mass-produced items was staggering. There was a profound, quiet violence in the realization that while Japan had been sacrificing its children's comfort for the sake of a failing divinity, the Americans had been perfecting the design of a child's workspace. The symbol of American abundance was no longer just the roar of an engine. It was the silent, sturdy presence of a desk that promised a child would never have to write on the floor again. The mothers looked at these objects and felt the first cracks in their ideological armor. The Americans were not here to take, they were here to build. October 1945. The autumn air in Tokyo is crisp, and for the first time in years, it is not choked by the thick, oily smoke of burning neighborhoods. In a small school district within the ruins of the capital, the arrival of a single American logistics convoy causes the world to stop. The heavy, rhythmic growl of the trucks, a sound that once signaled impending doom, now vibrates through the hollowed-out shells of nearby buildings. A group of Japanese mothers, their hair pulled back tightly and their clothes patched with meticulous, desperate care, stand in a ragged line near the school's entrance. They watch as the tailgates of the trucks drop with a heavy, metallic clang. The soldiers do not move with the rigid, screaming intensity of the Imperial Guards. They move with a relaxed, almost bored efficiency. They begin to unload crates marked with the stencil of the United States government. As the first crate is pried open, the sound of nails being pulled from wood echoes like a gunshot in the silent courtyard. What spills out is not the equipment of a garrison, but the furniture of a future. The women lean forward, their breath catching in their throats. They see the desks, not just one or two, but dozens, then hundreds. The historical record of the occupation notes that this was a deliberate effort by the Civil Information and Education Section to stabilize the nation through the restoration of its schools, but to the women standing in the dust, it felt like an encounter with a celestial power. The contrast in material reality was overwhelming. For years, these mothers had been told that American society was crumbling from within, that its people were soft and their industry was a hollow shell. They had been told that the Kichiku-bei were monsters who would bayonet the weak. Yet, here were these monsters, sweating under the weight of gifts for children who were technically the offspring of their enemies. The women looked at the desks, their tubular steel legs, their adjustable heights, their built-in inkwells and smooth, lacquered surfaces. They compared these to the charred, splintered benches their children had been using, and the cognitive dissonance began to tear at their hearts. There was a profound emotional weight in the realization that these objects were brand new. In wartime Japan, nothing was new. Every piece of cloth was turned inside out to hide the wear. Every tool was sharpened until it was a mere nub of its former self. To see an entire truckload of pristine, mass-produced excellence was to understand, in a single moment, the true scale of the power that had defeated them. The recurring sound of the trucks, which had once been a harbinger of terror, was now the soundtrack of an incredible, inexplicable generosity. As the GIs began to carry the desks into the skeletal remains of the classrooms, the mothers remained frozen. They were not just seeing furniture. They were seeing the physical manifestation of a philosophy that placed the value of a single child's education above the needs of a military empire. The silence of the courtyard was soon replaced by the soft, rhythmic sound of metal feet being dragged across the floorboards, the sound of a new foundation being laid. The sensory impact of the American desk was not merely in its existence, but in its meticulous industrial perfection. For a Japanese woman in 1945, the world had become a jagged place of splinters and rusted edges. To run a hand over the surface of these imported desks was to experience a tactile shock. The wood was kiln-dried maple, sanded to a degree of smoothness that felt almost like polished stone, coated in a thick, protective lacquer that caught the dim light of the classroom. There were no knots, no cracks, and no signs of the desperate, hurried craftsmanship that had defined Japanese production in the war's final years. These were objects born of a society that had the luxury of time, the luxury of precision, and the luxury of quality. The recurring sound of the American trucks idling outside, A deep, low-frequency vibration served as a constant reminder of the energy required to bring these objects across an ocean. Each desk featured a frame of tubular steel, bent with a mathematical accuracy that made the traditional wooden joinery of Japan look fragile and archaic. The steel was painted in a signature olive drab or slate gray, a finish so durable it resisted the scratches of the children's heavy, metal-rimmed slate pencils. Even more startling were the integrated features: a deep, spacious cubby for books and a precision-drilled inkwell hole. In a nation where a single glass bottle was a prized possession, the idea of a desk designed with a dedicated space for liquid ink was an overwhelming display of specialized abundance. The mothers stood in the doorway, watching as the GIs adjusted the heights of the desks. The desks were not static, they were adjustable, designed to grow with the child. This small mechanical detail carried a profound ideological weight. It suggested that the American system viewed the child as a developing individual whose physical comfort was a priority, rather than a nameless unit of the state who must adapt to the hardships of the environment. In the Imperial era, the child served the desk, sitting in rigid, painful silence as a form of discipline. Now, the desk served the child. The weight of the wood and the cold, solid strength of the steel frame spoke of a permanence that had been missing from Japanese life for a decade. For the Japanese women, the desks became a mirror. Looking at the varnished surfaces, they saw the reflection of their own exhausted faces, but they also saw the impossibility of their former leaders' claims. They had been told that American industry was a frantic, low-quality effort of a dying capitalism. Yet, the physical evidence in front of them, the sheer weight and durability of a simple school desk, proved that American weakness was actually an insurmountable mountain of resources. The sound of the GI's heavy boots on the wooden floorboards, punctuated by the metallic clack of the desks being set into rows, created a new rhythm of life. It was the sound of a superior material reality asserting itself, not through the firing of a gun, but through the placement of a chair. The mothers began to realize that the war had not been lost on the battlefield alone. It had been lost in the factories and the forests where such abundance was cultivated. The varnish on the wood wasn't just a coating, it was a window into a world of limitless potential. The true shock of the American arrival lay in the distribution of these resources. In the old world of Imperial Japan, quality was a privilege of the elite, a reward for those closest to the center of power. Education was a ladder where the rungs were often broken for those at the bottom. But as the crates were emptied in the dusty courtyards of ruined neighborhoods, it became clear that the Americans intended for every child to have a desk. This was the democratic ideal translated into physical matter. There was no sorting of students by rank or lineage. The GIs simply moved from room to room, filling every corner with the same high-quality steel and maple furniture. The recurring sound of the trucks, a low-frequency hum that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the onlookers, underscored the sheer scale of this egalitarian mission. Historically, this was the beginning of the fundamental law of education, a sweeping reform that aimed to strip away the militaristic hierarchies of the past. To the Japanese mothers, however, the reform wasn't found in a legal document, but in the sight of a poor orphan from the streets sitting at the exact same desk as the son of a former government official. The abundance was so vast that it ignored social class. The American machine did not discriminate, it simply produced. The desks were uniform, symbolizing a new type of citizenship where the state provided for the individual rather than demanding the individual be sacrificed for the state. The mothers watched as the classrooms were transformed from dark, empty shells into organized rows of opportunity. This display of mass-produced equality was a direct assault on the propaganda that had sustained the war. The Oni from the West were not just providing, they were providing equally. In the silence of the school hallway, the sound of a GI humming a jazz tune while he bolted a chair to a frame was a jarring contrast to the grim, silent labor of the Japanese war years. The symbolic weight of the desk, its sturdy, unwavering presence, represented a promise of stability that reached across the ruins. For a woman like Hannah, seeing her child's name written on a piece of masking tape and stuck to one of these magnificent objects was a moment of profound transformation. It was the realization that in this new world, her child was seen as someone worthy of the best the victors had to offer. As the sun began to set over the jagged skyline of Tokyo, the classrooms glowed with the reflection of the new varnish. The sheer volume of desks arriving day after day proved that this was not a one-time gesture of propaganda, but a fundamental shift in reality. The trucks continued their rhythmic, powerful arrival at schools across the prefecture, their engines a constant reminder of the ocean of resources now flowing into Japan. The mothers began to understand that democracy was not an abstract concept discussed by politicians. It was the ability to give every child a smooth surface upon which to write their own future. The physical presence of the desks acted as a silent teacher, instructing the people that abundance was the true fruit of a free society. The era of the divine wind had passed, replaced by the steady, heavy march of American steel and the quiet, revolutionary promise of a seat for everyone. It was in the quiet moments after the soldiers moved to the next room that the tears finally came. These were not the sharp, jagged sobs of immediate grief, but a slow, rhythmic weeping that rose from a place of deep, structural realization. As the Japanese mothers stood in the corridors of the newly furnished schools, the sensory details of the scene overwhelmed their remaining defenses. The low, heavy rumble of the American trucks idling in the street, that recurring heartbeat of the occupation, seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards, shaking the dust of the old empire from the walls. They looked at their children, small and gray-faced from years of malnutrition, running their fingers over the cool, emerald-green steel and the glass-smooth maple of the new desks. In that tactile connection, a decade of propaganda simply evaporated. The weeping was born from a devastating emotional contrast. These women had been told that their children were the property of the state, meant to be hardened into weapons. They had been taught that the Americans were a people of shallow materialism who possessed no soul. Yet, the physical evidence of the enemy's soul was now arranged in neat, beautiful rows before them. To see an adjustable chair, designed with a curve to support a child's spine, was to realize that the Americans cared more for the physical well-being of Japanese children than the Imperial government had in its final, desperate years. The mothers wept because they realized their children had been sacrificed for a lie, while the demons they feared had brought the tools of a gentler, more abundant reality. The historical weight of these tears represented the true surrender of Japan. It was not the signing of the papers on the Missouri that changed the heart of the nation. It was the sight of a mass-produced school desk. Factual records of the era describe how teachers and parents were moved to silence by the sheer quality of the supplies. The women looked at the built-in inkwells and the sturdy, tubular metal legs, symbolic of an industrial power so vast it could afford to be kind. They realized that the Americans didn't just have more planes and more bombs, they had a better way of treating a human being. The desk became a mirror of their own exhaustion and a window into a world where a child's comfort was a sacred priority. As they wiped their eyes with the sleeves of their patched kimonos, the transformation was complete. The sound of the American trucks, once the voice of a terrifying conqueror, had become the herald of a new era. The mothers understood that the war had been lost not because of a lack of spirit, but because the spirit they had been given was one of death, while the spirit of the occupation was one of life and growth. Every desk was a testament to the fact that the Americans lived in a world of limitless potential, a world where there was enough for everyone, even the children of the defeated. The tears were a mourning for the years lost to darkness and a quiet, salt-stained welcome to the light of an unexpected abundance. The classroom, once a place of cold indoctrination, was now a sanctuary of polished wood and silver steel, shielded by the protective hum of the great engines outside. The transformation of the Japanese classroom was not merely a change in furniture, but a systematic dismantling of the architecture of war. For decades, the schoolhouse had served as the primary forge of the imperial subject, a place where the Imperial rescript on education was recited with religious fervor and where children were taught that their highest purpose was to die for the throne. The physical environment had mirrored this grim philosophy, dark, rigid, and devoid of any consideration for the individual. But as the American desks were bolted into place, the very air in the rooms seemed to shift. The recurring sound of the American trucks, idling with a low, mechanical purr outside the windows, provided a constant acoustic backdrop to this rebirth, a reminder of the vast industrial engine now fueling the nation's peace. This was the era of re-education, a period where the textbooks were literally being rewritten. In many classrooms, students were instructed to use black ink to blot out the militaristic slogans and images of bayonets in their old books. Against this backdrop of censored history, the American desks stood as the first clean pages of a new chapter. The desks offered a physical stability that matched the intellectual shift toward critical thinking and individual rights. A child sitting at a desk designed for comfort was being told, silently but effectively, that their mind and body were worth protecting. The historical transition from the Meiji educational structure to the American-inspired 633 system found its most potent symbol in these workspaces. The emotional reflection of the teachers was as profound as that of the mothers. Educators who had once led their students in drills with wooden rifles now found themselves supervising classrooms that looked more like the suburbs of Ohio than the ruins of Tokyo. They watched as the children discovered the small details of American design, the way the desktop lifted on a hinge to reveal a hidden compartment, or the smooth, rounded edges that prevented injury. These were not the tools of a people obsessed with death, they were the tools of a people obsessed with the future. The transformation was evident in the way the children carried themselves. The rigid, fearful posture of the wartime years began to soften as they settled into the ergonomic curves of the new chairs. The symbolism of the desk as a workspace for peace became a cornerstone of the new Japanese identity. It represented a departure from the Seishin doctrine, which had glorified suffering as a merit. The presence of such high-quality material goods suggested that a nation's strength was not measured by the number of its martyrs, but by the quality of the life it provided for its youngest citizens. As the trucks moved from one prefecture to the next, spreading this gospel of abundance, the ideological victory of the occupation was secured. The Japanese people were not being conquered by force, but by the irresistible logic of a superior reality. The classroom had become a laboratory for democracy, and the American school desk was the primary instrument of the experiment. Through the windows, the sight of the olive-drab convoys no longer inspired terror, but a quiet, contemplative hope. The mind of Japan was being rebuilt, one sturdy, varnished desk at a time. The material shock of the occupation functioned as a catalyst for what historians would later define as the Japanese economic miracle. This was not merely a transition of political power, but a fundamental rewiring of the Japanese ambition, moving away from the conquest of territory toward the mastery of industry and quality. The American school desk was the first encounter with the standard of excellence that Japan would eventually seek to emulate and then surpass. The recurring sound of the American trucks, the deep, resonant thrum of engines that never seemed to fail, became the background noise of a nation learning a new language of production. To the mothers who had watched those first crates being opened, the desks represented a level of abundance that felt like a distant, unreachable star. Yet, within a generation, that star would be brought down to earth by the very children sitting at those desks. The legacy of these imported supplies was rooted in the concept of investment in human capital. For the first time in its history, the Japanese state, guided by the occupation's reforms, began to prioritize the infrastructure of the individual. The high-grade steel and the polished maple were physical proofs that a society's greatest strength lay in the education of its youth. As the years passed, the American style of school furniture was adopted and refined by Japanese manufacturers. The once alien sight of tubular steel and adjustable frames became the standard in every village and city. The emotional weight of the initial arrival, the tears of the mothers and the stunned silence of the teachers, matured into a national drive for quality. The shock of American abundance had revealed a gap that the Japanese people were determined to bridge through their own ingenuity and labor. This period of the occupation served as a massive, nationwide demonstration of the fruits of a peacetime economy. The sheer volume of material aid, ranging from food to sophisticated educational equipment, broke the cycle of desperation that had fueled the war. The mothers of the 1940s raised a generation that viewed the school desk not as a place of hardship, but as a place of infinite possibility. The sound of the trucks, which had once signaled a foreign invasion, eventually blended into the sounds of Japan's own burgeoning logistics networks. The abundance was no longer something that arrived in crates from across the sea. It was something that was being built in the factories of Osaka and the laboratories of Tokyo. The long-term impact was a profound shift in the Japanese psyche. The belief in a divine victory through suffering was replaced by a belief in a material victory through excellence. The school desk remained the quiet sentinel of this change. It was the place where the new Japanese citizen was formed, someone who understood that freedom was not just a political right, but the ability to live in a world where quality was a common expectation. The desks provided by the Americans had been a bridge, but the bridge led to a destination of Japan's own making. As the old green-painted American desks eventually wore out and were replaced by Japanese versions, the spirit of that first encounter remained. It was the memory of a moment when the world had been dark, and a simple piece of furniture had arrived to prove that the light of abundance was real and attainable. The story of the American school desk in post-war Japan is a narrative of an unbroken circle, a cycle of destruction, realization, and eventual synthesis. What began as a terrifying encounter between a defeated people and a formidable conqueror ended as a partnership that redefined the world. The desks, which once arrived in the back of olive-drab trucks, are no longer foreign artifacts. They are part of the bedrock of Japanese society. The recurring sound of the American trucks, that low, powerful hum of a civilization with energy to spare, has faded into the distant memory of a generation, replaced by the quiet, efficient pulse of a Japan that learned to manufacture its own miracles. The circle was completed when the students who first sat at those maple and steel desks grew up to design the technologies that would, in turn, be exported back to the West. In the final reflection of this history, the tears of the mothers in 1945 serve as the most honest document of the era. Those tears were the bridge between the old world and the new. They marked the moment when a nation realized that the enemy was not a monster, but a mirror reflecting a different way to live. The desks were the physical proof that a society's strength is not found in the rigidity of its military formations, but in the flexibility and care it extends to its children. The abundance of the American occupation was not just a display of wealth. It was a display of a philosophy that viewed every individual as a life worth cultivating. This was the unbroken circle, the transition from a culture of sacrifice to a culture of investment. The larger truth revealed by this simple piece of furniture is that ideology is most powerful when it is tangible. Democracy was not sold to the Japanese through leaflets or speeches. It was delivered in crates of kiln-dried wood and tubular steel. It was something a child could sit on, something a mother could touch, and something a teacher could use to build a lesson. The desks stood in the ruins of Tokyo as silent ambassadors of a world where there was enough for everyone. They proved that the most effective weapon against tyranny is not a bigger bomb, but a better school. The peace that followed was not a fragile truce between two armies, but a deep, structural shift in the values of a civilization. Today, the schools of Japan are among the finest in the world, characterized by a devotion to quality and a respect for the learning environment that traces its lineage back to those first shipments in the autumn of 1945. The memory of the American school desk remains a poetic testament to the fact that freedom is often most visible in the tools we give our children to build the future. The hum of the trucks has long since ceased, but the silence that followed is not the silence of the grave, but the focused, productive silence of a classroom. In that quiet, The legacy of a simple gift of wood and steel continues to resonate, reminding us that the greatest victory any nation can achieve is to turn its enemies into neighbors, and its battlefields into playgrounds for the mind. The circle remains unbroken, a testament to the enduring power of abundance and the quiet, revolutionary act of being kind.